What's going on, everyone? Welcome to another Bros Talking Soccer podcast. My name is Dave Knittel, and on today's podcast, I interview Robert Wilson, who is an investor, entrepreneur, and author of the Football Manifesto, which is a book that we discuss on here about revamping and sort of growing soccer in the United States. I'm doing this intro real quick by myself because Robert is down in Brazil. The audio connection and or internet connection is what I meant to say. The internet connection down there is not the greatest. So throughout the interview, we have technical issues. Also, both our videos are off. So this is the only time you're going to be seeing my pretty face. So enjoy it. But just wanted to give you the heads up. Again, this is a really cool interview. Robert is doing some amazing things. He's done a ton of research. He's got a lot of grandiose ideas about revamping the game in the United States. And again, I think you're really going to enjoy the interview, but wanted to give you this quick disclaimer before we get to it. So I'm going to shut up now. Again, say goodbye to this, and, I'll see you sometime soon. See ya. I'd like to welcome on Robert Wilson, who is an investor, entrepreneur, and author of the Football Manifesto. Robert, welcome to Bros Talking Soccer. How you doing today?
Good, Dave. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. Thank you for joining us. So for those who are listening, just a quick heads up, Robert is down in Brazil and the internet connection might be a little bit funky throughout this. Just wanted to give you the heads up early on, and we're going to do our best throughout this, but just, prepare yourselves. We may have a couple technical difficulties, but this is a fascinating conversation that I think we're about to have. So I'm really excited to get into it. So with that being said, let's jump into the interview. Robert, you're originally from St. Louis, which is, kind of a soccer hub in America. Can you talk about your experiences kind of growing up in the city and what your exposure to soccer was like growing up?
Sure. I grew up in literally in mid St. Louis City. St. Louis is situated in a larger kind of St. Louis County, and the city are separate jurisdictions, separate, administrations politically. And when I grew up, I literally grew up in the middle of the city in the ghetto. I mean, what we would call the inner city, hardcore. Back in those days, which is, I think it's safe to say was more segregation prone. Pretty much all the black people lived in one concentrated area of the city. So that's how in terms of demographic, as a kid growing up, I played basketball, baseball, and American football, which is, classic inner city sports. As I mentioned in the book, St. Louis itself was also a huge soccer town, which I now call football, for obvious reasons, having lived in Brazil so long. So the football scene in St. Louis was pretty amazing. Kid growing up. One, you had a school system, and the Catholic school system was really the promoter of football, soccer. Sports, they played the other sports as well, but they promoted it, and it made the the headlines in the newspapers and the sports pages with equal measure in respect to the other three big sports. We didn't have hockey in St. Louis, but certainly American football, basketball, and baseball, along with soccer, was sports page. You couldn't ignore it. And so you had this system which was literally massive. I mean, St. Louis, as you may know, is the only city in the world. I have my Catholic information correct. It's the only city in the world outside of Rome where you have a cardinal, a bishop. I think that's the nomenclature that's used. And oftentimes, in the context of Catholicism, St. called Rome of the West, because if something happened in Rome at the a huge amount of the archives of the Vatican are kept in St. Louis. So St. Louis has this Catholic footprint. We don't hear about it a lot nowadays, but when I was a kid growing up, it was huge. There's a big German population, a big Italian population in St. Louis. And those populations were the large drivers of the sport in St.Louis. And so, again, you couldn't miss it. It was all over the place. And that was pretty much my childhood. In the 1960s, my claim to fame in terms of following the sport was that Pelé and the Santos team came to St. Louis in the 60s to play a local team in St. Louis called the St. Louis Stars, which was, I'd say, semi-pro. It wasn't really pro in the kind of sense we usually think about. So, I got exposed. I just didn't play, and in St. Louis, I think historically speaking, St. Louis's contribution to the sport is probably equal to any city in the United States. And I'm including New York, Chicago, LA. I mean, it's the history of St. Louis with this sport is pretty impressive. So that was my initial kind of grounding, although I didn't play, but certainly got exposed to it.
And then you moved to Brazil. So flashing forward a little bit. So then you moved to Brazil, and I think that's what kind of sparked your deeper interest in soccer. So can you talk about living in Brazil and how you kind of got, sucked into the soccer or football world?
Sure. Yeah, I got down here in the late 70s. This was shortly after the 78 World Cup in Argentina. And I had already gone to college. I'd gone to law school, and I literally was just taking time off to try to get my bearings in life. And it's a long story about why Brazil, but I wound up here. And you help, and I guess this is one of the things that's kind of difficult for the United States to visualize. But living in a country that has a football culture is really a unique experience. I mean, we just don't really have it in the United States. I think that probably the closest thing that comes to the kind of passion, although I don't think it gets there, but I think the closest thing that comes to the kind of passion you see with respect to the sport in Brazil or any is NCAA college football or NCAA college basketball. That begins to go into the direction of the fanaticism, the dedication, the love, the passion, all that stuff. I think that that's probably as close as we get. Pro sports in the United States doesn't really get close to the passion. But having said that, it was a mind-blowing experience because this was still when Brazil was in its heyday as a kind of a literal factory of talent. And I lived and have lived in Rio the whole time I've been in, which is now over 25 years. I lived here twice. The first time was when I'm speaking about the late 70s into the 80s. I lived here for 4 years. And that's really when I got the bug. That's when Maracanã was still Maracanã. You could go to, a game at Maracanã on Wednesday night or, on the weekends. And it was incredibly common to get 120, 130,000 people in the stadium. And so games were unbelievable for a simple reason. Brazil really hadn't exported any significant abroad. I mean, everybody was here. All the stars were here. And it was like an all-star game on the field. I mean, it was mind-boggling. I mean, you think the Champions League is great to look at, and it is. Brazil was at that level and sometime on. So it was really, really amazing experience. And that's why, I got into the culture. I eventually joined a club called Flamengo, which is, I try to describe it as a kind of a dues-paying YMCA, but it's a multi-sport venue. So, in addition to soccer, football, you have volleyball, basketball, rowing, swimming, several Olympian swimmers at Flamengo. So it really is a club that's in a neighborhood in Rio de Janeiro that you can join, and you can go there and just, work out. If you're good enough, obviously, you can make a team sports that they provide. But without question, the dominant sport is football, soccer.
And you, I believe, had some sort of small role in owning a Brazilian club when you've been down there, correct? So can you tell us maybe a little bit about that and what your role was and what that process was like?
Sure. So now we're flashing forward a number of years into the late 90s. My wife and I married a Brazilian woman. We went back to New York. We for a long time. And then I began working for Citibank in New York, doing investing in the emerging markets. And long story short, we made basically Citibank created a fund which got approved in New York for Brazil's privatizations. I was sent to Brazil, set that fund up by the bank, and that's why we're here now. We raised about $1.5 million. With co-investment, it was more like $2 million. And out of that roughly $2 billion, we bought a controlling stake in a first division Brazilian club called Bahia, which is still, if I'm not mistaken, I think they're still in the first division. When we bought them, they fell out of the first division and then fell back down to second, and I think they might have even gone to third division. We got out of the investment about 5 years after we got in, which is but it was an incredibly, rich learning experience, because it basically exposed me to the inner workings of a legitimate first division Brazilian soccer club, with all the politics, with all the challenge finance, with all the challenge day-to-day administration. So that was really an eye-opener. And actually, a period of time, again, I think we made the investment in the spring of '98, I think it was. And I immediately got in touch with then MLS, Major League Soccer, which was, a brand new league. I think back then they only had 10 teams, I think. But I opened up a dialogue with the understanding that, maybe there's a way to, trade know-how, upstream to the United States, that kind of thing. So that's what my following in detail, the sport, not just in Brazil, but in the United States and in Europe and in the world. And as you probably remember, I think it was 2008 or 9, I'm not sure which, but Brazil, made the announcement that it was going to stage the 2014 World Cup. And so I began following the sport very closely. When the Cup came, it was, I think, a major success from the standpoint of an event. And the United States, as you may know, did decently well in the tournament. But the thing that stood out for me was the Facebook and Twitter usage during the 2014 World Cup by people from the United States. And the United States was also the largest foreign group of visitors in Brazil. So that was also something that kind of garnered my attention. And from basic 2014 World Cup through basically 2018, I decided to start a blog and do research on football, largely with a focus on the United States. So that's what prompted not just, a kind of diving into the subject, but also prompted the book. I mean, I actually took a number of interviews and articles that I published on the blog, and then, blew them out and got more details to support them in the context of the book.
And that's a fantastic transition into what I wanted to talk about next. So obviously I want to dig into the content of the book, but I also want to talk first about just the process of writing a book. So I know you believe you started with the blog, but can you tell us, what was the, I guess, impetus or when did you decide to go from a blog to a book, and how did that process kind of work?
So in the course of doing the research, I thought as time went on that I was uncovering the parameters of the potential for the sport in the United States. And I could not help but look at it from the standpoint of an investor. I mean, that's, professionally what I've done for a decent period of time. So the more research I did, the more I became convinced that this was potentially a huge upside opportunity from an investment standpoint. And in that context, the book became, in my mind, and still is in my mind, the first step in a process of investment that hopefully will take the sport next level, from the standpoint of professionalism and globalization and monetization. And so the book, the Football Manifesto and Club Handbook, bringing the beautiful game to the people and making the USA number one in the world, is a vision for how to literally transform the United States into the number one football nation on the planet.
And when you started writing, was it always with that goal in mind, or how did the book evolve as you went through and kind of finished writing and making this a book from the blog? Did it evolve at all, or was it always just kind of a natural evolution of just this was the goal and just kind of building out, the rest of the book?
No, to tell you the truth, it did evolve. When I began writing the blog, I wasn't really thinking about the transformation of the United States into the number one football nation on the planet. That really, my question was why. The basic question of the book was trying to understand why the United States, the richest country in the world, didn't have the best football league in the world, or at least a football league that was a rival in terms of revenue, global exposure, television, media, the whole nine yards, a rival to the English Premier League or to the Bundesliga in Germany, which I consider to be the top paradigms of the league structure in Europe.
Got it. And
so
continue.
So that's how I got that started. And basically, hold on one sec.
Yep.
Sorry for that.
No worries.
So when I started out, the attempting to answer that question, it was largely contextual, and it's kind of obvious that the United States has 4 renowned professional leagues, with the NFL for American football, Major League Baseball, the NBA for basketball, and the NHL for hockey. So those are major leagues. And so I did a substantial amount of research that did not get into the book about those 4 leagues and how they work, and how the states are structured, and how much money they're generating individually and collectively annually, how that revenue generation has grown over the years. So that information didn't really make it into the book. But I felt I needed to do that in the context of understanding just what the potential for football soccer was in the United States. And, not to mention, NASCAR, the NCAA, Hollywood itself. These entertainment options that we have for leisure time in the United States that I thought were absolutely crucial. And I also took, largely because I'm a fanatic for philosophy, and I majored in philosophy in college, but never went to grad school in philosophy. I went to law school instead, but I've kept a strong interest in philosophy. So I also wanted to get kind of a philosophical side to understand why this was occurring in why these 4 sports were generating collectively about $25 billion a year, and why and how football, soccer had never really broken into the big time. Like, what in the world was going on? How is that possible? And research then led me to the conclusion that this was being done on purpose, that there was a strategy behind the lackluster performance and the mediocrity of what MLS stood for, and also what the chaos in the pure MLS stood for. Like, why that way? Why is MLS the way it is, and why is the below MLS it is?
And I definitely want to dig into that, but just taking one step back, you said that you did so much research and you had to cut some. What was the thing you were either most disappointed, or what was the toughest thing that you had to cut from the book that you really wished, you could have gotten included in there? Do you have anything that comes to mind?
Uh, I know this sounds technical,
Hmm.
but I think probably the most important thing from my perspective that I felt was just premature at this point was a comparative analysis that I did on the respective collective bargaining agreements of the four. So I just couldn't stick that in there. There was just no way, that would be relevant at this stage. Um, I think that, needless to say, labor juxtaposed with management. I mean, labor, I think, is crucial. One of the things that the United States is dealing with respect to the product on the field, and the business models and the branding strategies, et cetera, is the fact that it got started in 1996, and the salary cap per team was 1.96 million per team. Now, when you start off, that's perfectly understandable, right? That is now 24 years ago. I think that's the number. I think it's 20. So I think they're in their 24th year. And the salary cap is 4.2 million. So over almost a quarter of a century, salary cap has increased, a little bit more than 100%. When you start at a number so low, like 1.6 million, and you can bring in the TAM payments and all the other additions, the Beckham rule, all that stuff that's out there to weed to how the average MLS team basically compensates talent and labor. But the fact of the matter is that MLS is underperforming dramatically, with respect to every measure of revenue generation at the sport when it's compared to let's say, the top leagues in Europe. And even, quite frankly, some of the leagues in Brazil and Argentina, which I think are, leaving Mexico aside for a second, I think that the money being paid for stars in Argentina, Brazil, is probably the highest in Americas outside of Mexico. I think they probably actually exceed Mexico on average. But having said that, the question was, what's going on here? Like, why are they getting paid so little? And how can we change it? Well, what do we do to change it? And we haven't even gotten to the issue of women's football. That's another kettle of fish. But men's side, which is, at least in theory, where the initial entree into the billions of revenue that's potentially there has to take place, I began thinking, not only is this research revelatory, but it also pretty much points in the direction of a major investment opportunity as well.
Yeah, and we're going to dig into the content, last non-content of the book question. You, I believe, kind of published this somewhat independently. So how did you actually go about publishing and then selling the book? What is involved in that process of, all right, I wrote this book. It looks fantastic. It looks like, it's a professionally done book. What was involved in getting it published and then starting to sell it on Amazon and wherever else it's being sold?
So first and foremost, I was responsible for the content, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I wrote it up in Word, obviously made teen addition changes going forward. I mean, I created a product and I reread it, I don't know how many times. Eventually I got to a product where I felt it was halfway decent. I couldn't get any publisher. When I was interested in getting it published, it was just before the World Cup in Russia. And I thought, Jesus, I'm not going to get this thing published unless I just self-publish it. So I literally went on Amazon and read about Amazon's Kindle and the entire kind of A to Z publishing platform that they've created for individuals, like, I guess you'd say. And I decided, Jesus, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna make it happen. Now, I'm gonna be honest with you. It was really hard to do. I mean, I was just like just to think that I actually got through the process is mind-boggling. But I did get through the process. I hired out the cover, which was really the only kind of graphic art that I needed. So I had a third party, a buddy of mine who's in the States, who is a professional graphic artist, do the cover. And then with that cover in hand, I was able to go through all of the steps via Amazon's platform. I used a number of texts that Amazon suggests that you use in order to publish a book. I followed their suggestions and eventually got out an online version on Kindle and also a paperback. And my goal short term is to get an audio version of the book as well online. But right now it's entirely self-published on Amazon. And it was an amazing learning experience. I mean, it's mind-boggling to tell you the truth. I could do that, but I mean, it shows you where technology has taken us.
Yeah, that's so cool to hear. And I love talking to people like yourself that are doing things. You don't just have these ideas, you're actually putting it into action and putting all this effort in. And I bought the book, I read it cover to cover, and it was a fascinating read from a lot of perspectives. And it's just awesome that you were able to do this and kind of do it yourself. So with that, let's get into the book. And the first thing that I kind of wanted to talk about in the main section that kind of the book kicks off with is you talking about branding and branding in this country for soccer or football. So can you tell us a little bit and elaborate on the existing clubs, what they get wrong, and what you think needs to be done to fix that?
Sure. So I think back to the marketplace for professional sports, right? We have a marketplace in the United States where the big four, the NFL, Major League Baseball, the NBA, and the NHL, generate collectively about $25 billion a year. And that is the primary juggernaut of the marketplace for team sports. So in other words, if football soccer wants to penetrate a market segment and either carve out a portion of the existing market or create its own market, it can't do it by using the same basic essence of the branding strategy and model of the big four. In other words, to put it bluntly, you can't copy the big four branding perspective and expect to carve out market share of any significance. Now, that's being said in the context of else that's been going on in the United States, particularly since 1990, which is that the marketplace in the United States for professional sports has gone through a major transformation. So, in the past 25 odd years, a little bit 25 years, those respective big four sports every year have generated more revenue. And the question is, having awakened to the role of technology and what technology and television and all that media, digital media has done over the past 25 years, is something that has to be addressed by football soccer in order to leverage itself into a new form of revenue generation. Now, if you look at MLS today, it's, I think, 24th year. MLS is generating, by my estimation, somewhere in the neighborhood of $500 to $700 million a year, depending on the year. Now, the reason I'm saying depending on the year, because in the year 2016, when the United States was the footprint for America, which I think was the anniversary of Copa America, that was a special occasion where the United States, and particularly some U.S. Soccer's for-profit, marketing arm, was able to make more income because of that event. So I think they got closer to probably $750 million that year in revenue. But I think in general, they're generating somewhere around 500,000, 600 million a year. That number, as you can, is not a huge number when you to the best football leagues in Europe. So since MLS's current television contract is $90 million a year, the common assumption is that 30 million of that siphoned off to U.S. soccer. So it's basically $60 million a year for 24 clubs or 24 teams. The EPL's television contract this year is $2.7 billion. So it begins to put, MLS in perspective globally. So long story short, I think that the upside potential with respect to branding, for me, falls along a different set of branding parameters. I think we have to think about branding in a different way. And so that's what I outline in the book. I outline it from two perspectives. One perspective is the brands themselves from the standpoint of how they penetrate into the market. And the aspect is much more of a psychological aspect. It is, what about these new brands is going to trigger revenue generation? How are they going to do it? And, jumping back to my penchant for philosophy or just like intellectual history, I'm not sure if you or your audience has read Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst who passed away many years ago. He was an incredible thinker along the lines of what we need to do to understand the psyche of individuals and groups, nations, the world. And one of the concepts he came up with was the collective unconscious and its ability to generate a tremendous amount of images, what are in some sense called signs. But this generation that we experience as human beings has been augmented dramatically in the past 20 years, but particularly in the past 15 with social media. So the visual side of culture that we're seeing now in the United States and globally is really a first-time phenomenon. We've never had as many archetypes, the word that Jung used, never had as many archetypes circulating amongst ourselves as we do now. And this is literally a phenomenon that's taken place in the past 10 or 15 years. So what am I trying to drive at? What I'm trying to drive at is that in 1990, the population of the United States was about 250 million. I think it was like 248, but let's say 250. Today, the population of the United States is 328 million. So you could say 330 million. So roughly from 1990 till now, we've added 80 million people to the population in the United States. 80 million is roughly the population of Germany. And the reason I'm harping on this issue of 80 million is because the vast majority of that 80 million, the vast majority of those newborn or first generation immigrants that came to the United States or now living in the United States are basically coming from football cultures outside the United States. So they understand the cultural perspective they're bringing, and they're also able to meld that cultural perspective with the United States. What that basically means is there are undiscovered brands in the United States that could be absolutely killer brands in the United States for this sport that we just haven't found yet. And basically what I've done to divide the branding world into three parts. The first part is a tier 3 brand. A tier 3 brand is a local brand or a regional brand, which is basically all we've ever had. That's all we've got in the United States. I'll speak to the cause in a second. But right now, if you look at MLS or you look at USL, all brands are basically local brands. That is to say, they're going to monetize, they're going to penetrate people's hearts and minds at the level. and not beyond that. There's another brand which we have never really seen in the United States, which is a national brand. And I think that you could argue and say, well, that's something that the Cosmos attempted to do. The Cosmos was an attempt to have a national brand, even though it was based in New York. I'll go back to that. And then the third tier, which is tier one, are brands. And global brands are like Barcelona, Real Madrid, Manchester United, Man City, PSG, Juventus, Borussia Dortmund, Bayern Munich. Those are global brands. They monetize globally. They have global followings. They have fan bases in China, or fan bases in Latin America, or fan bases even in the United States. They're basically global brands that sell merchandise and monetize on a global basis. So my argument in the book is that we have to have a different branding strategy for the sport. And that branding strategy also has to be married to a different and much more robust business model for in order for us to achieve what is the ultimate goal, which is to establish the global standard of excellence for the sport in the United States. So, you know, for instance, MLS today has Red Bull in New Jersey. I mean, what does Red Bull have to do with anything, right? I mean, my God, it certainly doesn't do with the sport. It also has nothing to do with New Jersey, but that is nevertheless a brand. I mean, we could potentially have a brand and call it Coca-Cola, or, you know, have a brand someplace down south and call it Dr. Pepper. I mean, that kind of branding for me is bordering right on the edge of absurd. And it's also not something that has, you know, monetization upside. Same thing is true for the Earthquakes. I mean, why would you, you know, support a team called the Earthquakes? I'm sorry. I mean, that's just my prejudice. But, and it's not to criticize anybody on the personal level, but I just think in terms of resonating, in terms of monetization potential, we don't really have brands today in football at any level, men or women, that resonate and that really connect with people. And because we've got this new demographic profile in the United States, which is a melting pot, and it's also to Canada as well. This melting pot hasn't been leveraged, hasn't been taken advantage of, and I think it can and should be in order for the sport to get off the ground and become the dominant sport that it potentially could in the States.
And the next section of the book, you get into the revenue and business models, which leads into what you're touching on there. So you could tell us a little bit more about the different business models that exist for football clubs or soccer clubs around the world, and the, you know, advantages and disadvantages of each.
Sure. So let's start with the United States first. The United States has a football / professional team ownership model that is pretty standard. Certainly the big four sports are basically sports that can only be owned by extremely wealthy people. We're talking about people who are in the top 1/10 of 1%, not 1%, but the top 10th of 1%. People who are billionaires are certainly close to being a billionaire, have to have that kind of wealth to own a professional. The same thing is at MLS, except that MLS, instead of having individual owners, instead of having 123 owners across the big four sports, MLS has taken a different approach, which I think has legal and organization implications. But the single entity concept, which is what MLS is, basically says, okay, we're going to control the administrative side of the sport and the expenses accrued on an annual basis or even a monthly basis at MLS via this LLC that we've created. And all the investors invest in the LLC itself. Now, obviously, they've got a separate arm called Sock United Marketing, or SOM, which is there to focus on the revenue generating side of the equation. But basically, those two LLCs work hand in hand to manage the sport going forward. And, you know, MLS has confirmed on multiple occasions that they're losing money. I mean, every year they're generating losses, $120 or $200 million a year. So for almost 3 decades, the league and the clubs have collectively been generating losses. Now, you know, I'm not going to go into the tax LLCs and all that kind of stuff. But just suffice it to say that the IRS code is helping sustain this business model. And that is the only reason, the IRS code is the only reason that this business model has remained viable for 2.5 decades. Having said that, there are 5 business models. So we just talked about 2 business models. One is MLS's adaptation of the high net worth individual model, which is dominantly the big 4 sports. But MLS version of the high net worth individual model is what it is. It's a single entity where all the investors come in and invest. Outside the United States, there are 3 other dominant models for football clubs. And I have to say that I think inside the United States, we do not have the true concept of a club. We have soccer teams. We do not have a concept of a football club in the United States. And I think that's what we have to have in order to take the sport to the next level. So here in Brazil, I mentioned that I'm a member of the club. Flamengo is, certainly one of, if not the leading club in Brazil and Latin America in terms of fan support. The fan base for Flamengo in Brazil is larger than the population of Argentina. It's about 44 million people. Obviously, not all of those people pay a monthly dues to Flamengo. That's a much, much smaller group of people. I would say probably considerably below 1% of the support group. But nevertheless, there are people who support the club financially by paying a monthly due to the club, monthly dues to the club. That multi-sport venue and that monthly payment of dues is very common with sports clubs in Latin America. I mean, Boca Juniors has the same model. River Plate has the same model. A lot of clubs in Latin America have the model. And when you jump to Europe, things change because the only clubs that are truly owned by the fans, 100% owned by the fans, are in Spain, interestingly enough. Now, I think Bilbao is also 100% owned by the fans, but the 2 clubs that we know the best are Barcelona and Real. And this year, according to Deloitte, Real Madrid, 91,000 paying members, was the highest revenue-generating sports franchise in the world. I think they generated in U.S. dollars, transferring the peso to the dollar, over $800 million in revenue last year. Barcelona is not that far behind. Barcelona is, again, 100% owned by the fans. They've got over 100,000 paying fans that pay a monthly fee to the club. That monthly fee for Barcelona generates a little bit more than $30 million a year. So you think about it. 1,000 fans that are paying roughly $30 million a year. That's like 7 times what MLS's salary cap is just from fan support. Now, obviously, Barcelona is generating over €500 million, well over euros a year, as is Real Madrid. But I'm making that model, a kind of a standout paradigm, because why couldn't that happen in the United States? There's nothing stopping us legally from doing that. We can do that. It just hasn't been done. So that's the third model, basically the model where the fans own 100% of the club. The fourth model is the Bundesliga model, which is dominated in Germany, is imposed on the clubs in Germany by law. So that is to say, these sports clubs, which are largely football dominant, have to be controlled by the fans by law. What that means is created something called the 50% plus 1 share rule, which means that the fans have to control 50% of the shares plus 1 share, so they always have voting control. And they can, on the other side of the equation, from 49 shares minus 1 share down, they can have third parties come in to support them. So the team that we host, the club we know the most, is Bayern Munich. Bayern Munich is 75% owned by the fans and 25% owned by 3 institutional investors: Audi, the car company, Adidas, and Allianz Insurance. So they split that 25%, roughly 8.3% or whatever it is, equally. But all the clubs in Germany operate under that model. Now, there are a couple of exceptions. It's an exception because they're grandfathered in. Wolfsburg is owned by Volkswagen. Bayer Leverkusen grandfathered in because they were owned by Bayer, or still are. And then most recently, Leipzig became a member of the top tier Bundesliga. And their story is actually kind of interesting because Leipzig is actually run and controlled by Red Bull. Red Bull bought a fifth division German team, and basically grew it over, I don't know how many years it's been now, 5, 6, I'm not sure how many years. But they a team out of the fifth division, and I think this past season in the Bundesliga, I think Leipzig came in third. I think.
So yep, that's correct.
So they've. I mean, that's just that alone is a pretty amazing story. How they did that, and how it took place, how much money took place, I don't know those issues, but I mean, I would certainly like to see a study of somebody, come up with something that explains the rise of Leipzig to the first division of the Bundesliga. And then last but not least, the fifth business model is Swansea City. Swansea City is a model that goes back to this high net worth individual concept. Swansea was in the division in, I think, the 2017-18 season. I'm pretty sure they were. And it was either that season or the season before that a group of American investors bought into Swansea City. Swansea was one of the few clubs entirely owned by the fans. The owner and bought up a majority stake, so they control the club. I think they bought something like 75 or 80% of the club. And I think the fans now are left with 20, 21, 22% of the club. But those fans also have a place on the board. So the fifth model is where the fans have a minority stake in the club, and the majority stake in the club is held by high individuals. So those are the 5 models. And my argument in the United States is that there is absolutely no reason we can't implement 1 or 2 or 3 or possibly all 5 business models. Those 5 business models work under one umbrella, obviously with promotion and relegation. But when people tell you that promotion and relegation is unfair or that it doesn't work, I think that the response of the United States is pretty clear. A lot of the investors in MLS are basically investing in football clubs in Europe, and they have promotion and relegation in Europe. So why would they be averse to investing in promotion and relegation in the United States? This idea that it's unfair is bordering on the absurd. Because if you're a high net worth individual and you've got billions of dollars, it makes no sense to think, oh, well, I may get pushed down to the second division. Well, the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of clubs in Europe that do that don't get pushed down to the second division. Swansea, of course, did. They fell down to the second division, but the vast majority don't. And if you've got the deep pockets to put that kind of club together, the likelihood is you're going to stay indefinitely.
And clearly you've done a tremendous amount of research and are super knowledgeable about all of these things. If you'll allow me to either play devil's advocate or just counterpoint, and I just want to get your perspective on things, because
Sure.
I have a slightly different perspective. But what do you just say to someone like myself who maybe thinks that, I know in the book you highlight that the club model of, fans owning the club would be, probably the best model to go for. Do you think that the American market is patient enough to let those clubs actually grow? Or do we have enough, other sports, other entertainment choices where the American public might lose interest in the club if they're not growing and then kind of move on? How do you respond to something like that?
Let me say this. I think that the idea of a grassroots owned league is perfectly feasible. And I'm saying this in juxtaposition to MLS, because MLS's salary cap, let's forget a cap of 4.2 million. Let's just say that each MLS franchise is spending about $10 million a year on payroll, including staff and players. So you multiply that by 24 teams, and it's basically $250 million a year in that kind of an expense. Now, my argument is that with brands and with the technology we have now with social media, whole issue of monetization via mobile, et cetera, that we could replicate at least what MLS is doing. So are there people out there that would spend, $10 a month, $20 a month, $50 a month to start a club? So, and I think that especially is the case if you take consideration this new club business model. So for instance, there's a company in the United States called Equinox, which is a very upscale club that you can join to go work out and what have you. Let's imagine that you had an Equinox inside of a club that was branded for football. Obviously, it's not going to be Equinox, it's going to be something else. But let's say you've got a club like that inside your club. If you're in New York and your football club offers those kinds of amenities and exercise routines, yoga, whatever, you can join that club and go. And it just so happens that club also is on the field every year, a men and a women's football club under the same brand. Why not? Why wouldn't you join? I mean, Equinox, to the best of my knowledge, it depends. Obviously, the monthly fee varies across the country. Different parts of the country, demographically speaking, richer than others. But let's say in New York, paying $200 a month to be a member of Equinox. Well, if you had a club that was offering you what Equinox offered you, benefits and other privileges to join that club and maybe, take in a game or two on the weekends, not to mention have the club open for, courses that you might want to take. Let's say you want to take a coding course at the club that's being, if you're paying a monthly fee and the club is bringing, quality product to you, why wouldn't you pay $200 a month to join that club? It would, you're doing it already, I mean, people spend tremendous amounts of money at clubs already, all throughout the United States. It's just that none of them are branded with a football club in mind. And I remember when I was working for Citibank in New York, I used to have a routine where I'd train in Midtown Manhattan and go straight into a Starbucks and buy myself a bagel or something. It would be around $10, right? So I was spending $50 a week on coffee and bagels. I mean, why wouldn't you support a club that was doing, offering you some great camaraderie? You could go there on the weekends with your family and have lunch. You could, take your friends and meet them there at the bar at the club to watch the game if they're a game, or you could go there and watch games in Europe on the TV. But it would be a private club. You'd be a member of that club. So that's basically what I'm trying to sell in the United States. I think that never existed really in the United States. And I think now, based on the demographics and based on where technology has taken us, we're ready for that kind of business model. And you couple that with the branding, and I think we've got a new paradigm for the sport.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I do find most interesting from your book is the sport and social club concept. And, I think I'm interested to see how it plays out. And again, I think that there is serious potential there. So those are fascinating points that you bring up there. I'm trying to think of, we're running a little bit long here. So I had a couple other questions and I'm trying to think of what the best way to deal with this is, so let's kind of wrap things up on this one. And you in the book kind of mentioned the influence of this, I don't know, triumvirate. I know that's not, I don't think exactly what you call it, but these three sort of forces lurking below the scenes that are sort of influencing the soccer culture in the United States. And that is the influence of FIFA, the National Football League, and then MLS and some on the soccer landscape in the U.S. Can you expand on what you believe is happening there?
Sure. I think that the overwhelming dominant statistic is pretty simple, and it's staring us in the face, and that is that 70% of the players in the NFL are Black, African American. The remaining 29 or 30% are white Americans. I think it's less than 1% Hispanics play in the NFL. So the statistic for that 70% number of the players in the NFL who are Black basically says the following. Through and I'm saying American football.
Oh, Robert, we lost you a little bit. Can you just go back just maybe 10 seconds? You went completely silent there. So you started to say about the NFL. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. So 70% of the players in the NFL are Black / African American. That basically means that the NFL has a pipeline of talent from Pop Warner through high school American football, through the NCAA American football, and into the NFL. That pipeline is worth annually billions of dollars to the NFL. And what that means is that it makes all the sense in the world for the NFL to protect that pipeline as much as they can. Now, again, demographics have changed in the United States dramatically over the past 25 years. So the people that live in the United States now don't necessarily, in the same degree and percentage, support the NFL the way they used to. We've got, I would say, 80 to 100 million people in the United States not spend their dollars in the direction of the NFL or any of the other big three sports. I mean, not for American football, not for baseball, not for basketball, not for hockey. We've got, from my estimation, about 100 million people who are quote unquote ethnic. But that could be European ethnic, it could be African, it could be Asian, it could be Latin American, it could be even the United States. We've got a bunch of people that are not being monetized. And so what that means is that the pipeline that the NFL has was a motivation 20, 25 years ago when MLS started. It was basically started, in my opinion, to make sure that inner city youth that filled the NFL's pipeline would not get diverted to another sport, namely football, soccer, anytime soon. So it makes all the sense in the world for them to have created MLS and to have largely controlled MLS and U.S. soccer for the past 25 years to make sure that pipeline is protected. So that's one leg of the stool is the NFL. Leg of the stool is UEFA, FIFA. And all of this goes to the issue of why the United States could potentially be a world-class nation for football, soccer. If in fact the United States was a world-class nation paying wages like the English Premier League or like the Bundesliga or any of the other big leagues in basically siphon talent domestically. I think you'd see a migration of talent away from certain sports in the United States, particularly the NFL, in the direction of football, soccer. But also impact Europe. Because today, if you turn on your television and ask, where are these players that are playing in the Champions League? Where do they come from? They come from all over the world. All over the world. So if the United States all of a sudden creates a world-class league, paying world-class wages, I'm not saying that we're going to cipher 100% of those players from the United States. No, that's not going to happen. But we would siphon a percentage of those players to the United States from Africa, Asia, from Latin America primarily. And that would basically be the, the foundation for the United States to become the best league in the world. And I think that's what's going on here. I think the question is, we've got some people in the United States who are running U.S. soccer and US, and they do not want the United States, categorically, they do not want the United States to be the best in the world. Because if you're best in the world, it carries these implications. It carries implications for FIFA and UEFA, and it carries implications for primarily. So I think that's a motivating factor for why MLS, one of the reasons why MLS is so mediocre and why they are very intent on maintaining the status quo. Now, not to mention their position on promotion and a bunch of other stuff for pay and all that. But, not to mention the women's game. They're all as ancillary issues surrounding MLS's mediocrity, which I deal with in the book. But my overall issue is, if you had a professional league at the top tier globally, it would impact the NFL and it would impact FIFA and UEFA.
Yeah, and so the book is fascinating, and again, there's so many aspects of it that I would love to see implemented. And so what are the next steps for you as you look to implement this vision? So I believe this is part 1 of 3 separate books. So if people want to learn more, reach out, what are the next steps both for you and or what can people do to help out?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is on Amazon. You can just go to Amazon and put in the Football Manifesto and it should pop up. The second step in the process got started about 6 weeks ago, which is I now have a Patreon page, which is patreon.com/the Football Manifesto. And that's where you can go and get what amounts to be, at least initially, a summary of the book, but also allows you to begin to contribute as a founder, because I think that it's very, very important for grassroots individuals, for people in the United States to support this sport and support it under the assumption that they can own a football club. I don't think there's anything wrong with that in the United States, right? And now, thank God, crowdfunding technology lets us do this. So I'm basically interested in making a pitch to I shouldn't say 3.28 million Americans, namely 1% of the U.S. population. I want to try to get those people to support what I'm doing so I can bring more people into this so that we can literally have a fan and community-owned league and clubs in the United States. That's really what I'm pushing. That doesn't mean that millionaires and billionaires can't get involved. They most certainly can, and we should have them. But what I'm suggesting is that pro sports should be open to anyone. You don't have to be in the top 0.1% of the richest people in the country to get involved with this sport. So basically, I'm pitching to the grassroots, which can include wealthy people, but I'm also pitching to people that work at Starbucks or flip hamburgers at McDonald's. You too can get into this game, be an owner and participate in the passion and the culture, because one of the things we do in the United States is football culture. And this, in fact, this movement I'm hoping to create will create that culture, and it will allow people for the first time to own and become passionate about a newly branded, new business models and a new approach to the sport in the United States.
I love it. It's a bold vision, and one that I think, again, is incredible, and one that I, can get behind, and hopefully others can get behind from a grassroots perspective, because, again, it makes sense. We want the sport to grow here, and we want to feel invested. And so, again, I love what you're doing here. We will link in the podcast description, and if you're watching on YouTube, we'll link in the video description to Patreon and Amazon. Make sure to go visit Robert's websites there, and get involved, reach out to him. If you have someone that might be interested, tell people about it. If people want to get in contact with you, how can they get in contact with you?
Very easily. You can send me an email at thefootballmanifesto@gmail.com. That's thefootballmanifesto@gmail. That's the easiest way to reach me.
Okay, thefootballmanifesto@gmail.com. I assume all one word?
That's right.
Okay, and we'll add that into the podcast description as well. So, Robert, there's so much more I wanted to talk about, but hopefully we'll have to do this again sometime. Thank you so much for joining me today.
It's been a pleasure, Dave. Thanks for hearing the pitch, and looking forward to more conversations.
Absolutely. All right, listeners, hope you have a great day as well. We'll talk to you soon. See ya.
Bye-bye.